Welcome to our Virtual QOR Day at Casa Loma. I'm John Stevens, Curator of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada Regimental Museum and Archives. Normally at this time of year, our museum team would be at Casa Loma with reenactors and serving soldiers and cadets and the Regimental Band, all welcoming you to our QOR Day. But of course, that's just not possible this year. So we've tried the next best thing and prepared this virtual event to share with you. We tried to share some regimental history, including weapons and uniforms of various periods, highlighted a few artifacts we think are interesting, given some behind-the-scenes information about the museum, and included some musical segments from previous QOR days. But this year is also special for us, as we celebrate 50 years since the museum opened at Casa Loma. So I hope you'll enjoy our event as we begin with some messages of congratulations.
Hello, bonjour, bonjour. As Her Majesty the Queen's representative in Ontario, it gives me great pleasure to congratulate the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada Regimental Museum and Archives on reaching 50 years. And may I recognize that the museum's beautiful home, this Casa Loma, stands upon territory stewarded over countless generations by Indigenous peoples, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's particularly meaningful that this museum should be celebrating such a happy milestone in this year, 2020. It marks the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a conflict in which the Queen's Own played such a valiant role. It is no small measure due to their courage and sacrifice that this year will also mark 75 years of the United Nations, an institution so emblematic of the consensus of hope that defined the last century and that continues to inspire our active role in the world. This museum ensures that we will never forget the contributions of those who serve in uniform and the many links that we all have to the Canadian Forces. Indeed, as Canada's oldest continuously serving infantry regiment, predating Confederation, the Queen's Own has been a stalwart contributor to building this country. And they are here today to help us rebuild. At last count, 119 members of the Queen's Own have actually been actively involved in responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And that is something of which we can all be very proud. It's vital that we hear the stories of those who serve in our armed forces. They are guardians of democracy. And we know that democracies are fragile and under threat these days, all around the world. The history on display at the museum, and also the great wealth of information that's available online, encourage us to think about how we are connected as part of something so much greater than ourselves. And as we continue to face the many challenges of the current global pandemic, we can look to the Queen's Own as we seek to foster mutual understanding and empathy while championing age-old values of duty, courage, and sacrifice. May I therefore commend the museum's Board of Governors and the entire Queen's Own Rifles family for their service over the past 50 years. I have no doubt that your future will be bright.
I'm very pleased to offer a few comments on the Regimental Museum. As most of you know, this is the 50th year of its arrival at Casa Loma in Toronto. The museum got its start in Calgary with the Queen's Own Rifles Battalion garrison there. In actual fact, with the depot of the Queen's Own Rifles when we had two regular force reserve battalion. And the idea came to light in 1956, and the museum stood up in 1957. So the museum itself is a little bit older, but certainly we are very proud as members of the Queen's Own Rifles regimental family to have our museum now housed in the hallowed halls of Casa Loma, a great facility historically, particularly from a Queen's Own perspective, but also a perfect venue to display our regimental history and regimental memorabilia. I'm reminded of a story which I'll tell you with respect to my time as a young officer in the Royal Canadian Regiment. When I arrived in 1RCR London in September 1967, we had quite a group of World War II veterans in garrison, either as retired or as still serving members of the regiment, many of whom became good friends. What's really interesting is I just finished reading Colonel Strom Galloway's 3 books of his war experience, one in Africa with the British Army, with the London Irish, and then 2 with the Royal Canadian Regiment with in Italy, landing at Piceno, and of course fighting all the way through Italy to the point where the Germans capitulated in Italy and the Royal Canadian Regiment was moved to Northwest Europe. Strom Galloway was, I think, the only individual, the only officer that I'm aware of that actually fought with the Royal Canadian Regiment from start to finish. That is, from landing at Piceno right through to the end of the war in Holland. So he's written a couple of very good books, based, I should add, on his diaries. And of course, people were precluded from having diaries during World War II, particularly serving individuals. So they thought there might be compromise, but Strom did that, took lots of pictures, and God bless him for doing it, because we now have a sort of day-to-day account of his experience in North Africa and Italy as a result of that. And thumbing through his book, Some Died at Ortona, I'll just hold that up there. I actually got copies from him personally in 1966. I looked at 2 pages, actually 3 pages of pictures of those who served in Italy. You can't see them clearly, but I just wanted to note that there is 35 pictures of the key regimental personnel who served during the Italian campaign. It just so happens that I knew personally 9 of those individuals, all of them having retired to the home station, except for Strom himself and our former Colonel of the Regiment, General Dan Scry. 4 of those 9 individuals actually became Colonel of the Regiment of the RCR. The story I really want to leave you with, or the fact I want to leave you with, not once did any of those individuals in the officers' mess in London talk about the war experience, which was a real shame. Real shame for them not to tell their story, but also a real shame for us young officers who were intimidated by these guys, by the way, to not ask them about their stories. And thank goodness again for people like Strom who put pen to paper and wrote those stories down. So my pitch here to members of the regimental family is really 2 or 3-fold. The first one is we are blessed to have the regimental museum that we do, and we should all be proud of it, and we should all play our part, not only in terms of visiting it, but adding to the story, providing our regimental memorabilia, providing our own stories, write them down so that those future generations can stand back and say, well, I have a good idea what went on back there in 2020 because so-and-so wrote the story down. But I'd also like to say, if you have an opportunity, and I'm sort of an old guy now, but certainly our war veterans, whether they be Korea War veterans still surviving, peacekeeping veterans, Afghanistan veterans, take the time and effort to ask them about their story. Some may not want to talk to you about it, but many will. And they'll feel comfortable talking to someone, particularly somebody who's been in uniform or is former serving and now out of uniform. So I leave you with that note. Please be proud of our history, but more importantly, contribute to it in any way you can. Thank you very much. Happy 50th anniversary to our museum in Casa Loma. Thank you to the volunteer crew who keep it running. To John Stevens, a curator, all his volunteers, serving, former serving, and students. And also thank you to the Liberty Group for providing us with the great space that we have and helping us to tell our regiment story. And Pace Paratus.
Shaun Kelly, former Regimental Sergeant Major of the Queen's Own Rifles and current Deputy Curator of the Queen's Own Rifles Museum. In the next few minutes, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the formation of the regiment in 1860, the Battle of Ridgeway in 1866, and the Northwest Rebellion in 1885. And we'd like to show you some of the related artifacts. Follow me. In the mid-1800s, the British Army was withdrawing its forces from Canada in order to deploy them to more pressing needs. The colonies had almost always had volunteer militia, but starting in 1855, Upper Canada, Ontario, and Lower Canada, Quebec, were expected to start to provide and fund their own voluntary militia. As a result, in 1859, Lower Canada had formed its own volunteer militia rifles battalion in Montreal, and by 1860, Lower Canada had amalgamated 6 existing independent volunteer rifle companies into the 2nd Battalion Volunteer Militia Rifles of Canada, which eventually became the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. One of the earliest artifacts the museum holds from that time is a shooting trophy donated by Sergeant Moulton of the 16th Regiment of Foot. It is likely that the 16th, as one of the last British regiments to leave Canada, would provide shooting instructors to assist the fledgling Canadian militia become proficient in the art of war. It's satisfying to know that he was dedicated enough to purchase a trophy to encourage marksmanship in the Queen's Own. By 1866, the Queen's Own will be called upon to test those marksmanship skills. On the night of May 31, 1866, a 1,000-man Irish Republican Army, known as the Fenians, made up mostly of U.S. Civil War veterans, would covertly cross the Niagara River from Buffalo with the intent to hold the colony of Upper Canada hostage for the release of Ireland from British rule. The Queen's Own were immediately mobilized, and by the morning of 2nd June had traveled by ferry and train to Port Colborne, Ontario. There, they combined with a force including the 13th Battalion from Hamilton. The plan was to secure the south end of the Welland Canal, then link up with a larger force of British regulars and volunteers, including cavalry and artillery, who were approaching from the north. The Fenians, under command of an experienced Civil War cavalry commander, decided to attack the smaller volunteer force first. They set up their defense at Ridgeway. The Queen's Own and the 13th Volunteers, under command of Colonel Booker of the 13th, initially fought well. They had done everything by the book and pushed the Fenians back for over an hour. However, because of their lack of ammunition and supplies and inexperience in battle, the initiative soon turned in the Fenians' favor. The Fenians, suffering from low morale, decided to initiate a bayonet charge, which routed the Canadians from the field. Both sides suffered similar casualties, but the Fenians, realizing larger forces were approaching from the north, decided to abort their invasion and attempted to return to Buffalo. Most of them were intercepted and arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard, who were finally called out. Some of the artifacts that the museum owns that were from the time are photos of the 6 companies taken a couple days after the battle, a glass plate photo of one of the riflemen, bullets found at the Ridgeway battle site, the bugle used at the battle presented to Captain Sherwood by soldiers of No. 8 Trinity College Company after the battle, and a Spencer carbine presented to Captain Boosted by his company for gallant conduct at the battle. One of the most important artifacts the Queen's Own Museum holds from the time of the Battle of Ridgeway is this tunic that was worn by Ensign Malcolm McEachran during the battle. He was unfortunately killed by a bullet within a few minutes of the battle starting and died 20 minutes later. By the late 1870s and early 1800s, the Indian tribes of the West were in a desperate situation. With the disappearance of the great buffalo herds, many were starving. Much of their land had been sold off for little gain. Louis Riel and a Métis provisional government challenged Ottawa. A few Cree bands joined the Métis. In March 1885, violence erupted. Many were killed and wounded on both sides. The fledgling Canadian Army was mustered and sent west to restore order. Led by Lieutenant Colonel A.A. Miller, the Queen's Own Rifles volunteered 274 officers and men to the Northwest Field Force, many stowing away on the train since numbers were limited. Departing by rail on the 30th of March 1885, the journey was bitterly cold, the troops having to march or ride in open sleighs between gaps in the partially completed railway. After almost a month of travel, the Queen's Own participated in the relief of Battleford and the Battle of Cut Knife Creek on May 1st, and eventually arrived back home to an enthusiastic welcome on July 23rd. Some of the artifacts the museum holds from that time are an 1885 canteen marked Queen's Own Rifles, a photo of the Queen's Own contingent returning from Northwest Rebellion, and a Snider Enfield short rifle used during the Northwest Rebellion.
Hello, my name is Rob Grieve. I'm a former member of the Queen's Own Rifles and also a volunteer of the Queen's Own Rifles Regimental Museum in Casa Loma. I'm here tonight to talk about the Snider Enfield rifle. The Queen's Own Rifles were initially issued Enfield pattern 1853 muskets, which are muzzle-loading rifles firing a 5.77-inch bullet. Loading this rifle was accomplished by measuring amount of black powder and pushing this down the barrel with a bullet and a cloth wadding down in the barrel into the chamber. Firing the loaded rifle was accomplished when the shooter squeezes the trigger, releasing the hammer to strike a percussion cap, which then ignites the powder. Reloading these rifles does take time and can be a troublesome process during wet weather or while under enemy fire. The British Empire used these muzzle-loading rifles from 1853 to 1867, after which most of these muzzle-loading rifles were converted to a breech-loading system. The pattern of rifles, this pattern of breech-loading rifle was the primary rifle used during the Battle of Lime Ridge, commonly known as Ridgeway. The example I have here is a Snider Enfield rifle that has been modified to use a breech-loading cartridge. The cartridge contains the powder and a 5.77 bullet packed together in one cartridge. Breech loading is faster and less labor-intensive. This pattern of rifle was in wide Canadian service from the 1860s to 1901 as one of the most widely used rifles of the Snider variation.
Hello. In the next few minutes, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the South Africa War, 1899 to 1900, the contribution that the Queen's Own made, and a few of the artifacts that the museum holds.
The South African expedition, 1899 to 1900, marked a turning point in Canadian military history. Instead of focusing on home defense, Canada provided an official contingent for an international crisis. More than 7,300 Canadians served and 267 died. When the Orange Free State declared war, Britain first requested 1,000 men from Canada for 1 year's service. The Queen's Own Rifles provided 33 soldiers to serve in C Company of the 2nd Special Service Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment, commanded by former Queen's Own officer, Lieutenant Colonel W.D. Otter. They left Toronto late October 1899 for Cape Town, South Africa, having exchanged their traditional rifle green uniforms for a summer duck canvas uniform by their arrival on 29 November 1899. They immediately entrained for the front and soon saw their first battle. Under the command of Captain R.K. Barker, they helped relieve Douglas, a small town under siege. Following this battle, the contingent fought bravely at Paardeberg Drift, where Rifleman Charles E.E. Jackson was killed, 6 riflemen wounded, and the famous charge was sounded by Queen's Own teen bugler Douglas F. Williams. While in South Africa, 2 Queen's Own soldiers also died from enteric fever, typhoid, Sergeant Albert Beatty and Rifleman Walter S. Blight. The Canadians fought bravely until their year's service expired. The unit was welcomed home to Toronto in November 1900.
One interesting object in our collection is an emergency ration used by Canadian and British troops during the South African War. Generally produced by the Bovril Company in England, these cylindrical lead tins were about 5.5 inches long and 2 inches in diameter. They were actually 2 separate tins joined together by a metal strip with a pull tab that could be used to separate the tins. The whole piece was wrapped with a paper label and instructed only to be used with permission of an officer. Each section also had its own lid, which were glued instructions on how to prepare them for eating. Certainly rations have come a long way since 1899. Number 7301, Sergeant Albert Beatty, was born in 1873 in Campbellford, Ontario, son of William Beatty and Eliza Victoria Smith. The family eventually moved to Bellwood Avenue in Toronto. In 1891, he joined the 48th Highlanders of Canada and served with them until 1894. Then joined the Army full-time at Stanley Barracks, where he served for 6 years. In the summer of 1899, Beatty retired from the regular force and joined the 2nd Battalion, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada, Captain Wyatt's company, as a colour sergeant. On October 20th, 1899, Beatty enlisted with the C Company, 2nd Special Service Battalion of the Royal Canadian Regiment, in order to serve in South Africa in what is commonly known as the Second Boer War. There he earned the Queen's Medal for South Africa with class for Paardeberg, Driefontein, and Cape Colony. Beatty died of enteric fever, what we today would call typhoid, on April 14, 1900, in Bloemfontein, and is buried there in President Brand Cemetery.
Hi, my name is Colin Pinn. I'm a curatorial assistant here at the Queen's Own Rifles Museum, and I'm going to talk specifically about the museum's collection and the unit's involvement during the First World War from 1914 and 1918. In August of 1914, war erupted in Europe, and it was not long before Great Britain and therefore Canada and the rest of the Commonwealth were entered in the conflict. Here at the museum, we have a number of cases and exhibits showcasing the regiment's rich history throughout the First World War. Many of the objects on display highlight the experience of the QOR soldier, while others have specific and fascinating stories behind them. By 1914, Canada had only one permanent regular force infantry regiment, the Royal Canadian Regiment, and so Canada had to begin massive recruitment efforts to organize and send over a Canadian Expeditionary Force, or CEF. As Toronto was one of Canada's largest cities, thousands of men from Toronto's militia regiments were mobilized and incorporated into this new CEF. At Valcartier on the 2nd of September 1914, the men of the Queen's Own Rifles formed the vast majority of the newly raised 3rd Battalion CEF, aptly known as the Toronto Regiment, and is made up of men from Toronto's militia units, namely the QOR, but also the 10th Grenadiers, now the Royal Regiment of Canada, and the Governor-General's Bodyguards, now the Governor-General's Horse Guards. While most of the Canadian battalions have regimental titles, all the battalions had a numerical distinction within the structure of the Canadian Corps, such as the 3rd Battalion. By mid-1916, this unit designation were further organized and with the introduction of a divisional insignia, or battle patches. We can see an example of 3rd Battalion's insignia on this original Mark I steel helmet here. In 1916 saw the first introduction of the Canadian divisional insignia, which is still in use to this day. Unlike the unit's current affiliation with the 4th Division, in World War I, the 3rd Battalion was part of the 1st Division, denoted by the same red rectangle used today. The green triangle above denoted the 3rd's brigade and seniority, with the color green always signifying the 1st Brigade within the division, and the 3-sided triangle knowing the battalion as the 3rd unit within that brigade, hence a 3-sided shape. The 3rd Battalion saw service throughout the conflict. It was part of the 1st Infantry Brigade, 1st Canadian Division, and was one of the first battalions to be sent overseas in October of 1914. During which the 3rd Battalion saw extensive action on the Western Front at all major Canadian engagements and has battle hours including the infamous first German gas attack at Second Ypres, Saint-Julien, Mont-Sorel, the Somme, Vimy Ridge, Arras, Hill 70, Passchendaele, Amiens, Canal du Nord, and pursuit to Mons. Back in Canada, the recruitment efforts of the Queen's Own Rifles in Toronto continued heavily throughout the war, and the Queen's Own also recruited the 83rd, 95th, 166th, 198th, and 255th Battalions. All of these were QOR battalions and now perpetuated by the QOR. However, these are merely replacement battalions in which to organize new recruits, and once overseas, these men would be sent to reinforce existing battalions within the structure of the Canadian Corps. We have several First World War era weapons on display, including a now deactivated Lewis gun. The Lewis was a light machine gun chambered in .303 fired from its 47-round drum magazine. The Lewis was first introduced in 1915 and was soon to be widely used across all British and Commonwealth forces. By 1917, it would become an integral part of all platoon and squad-level tactics, and by the late war period, every infantry platoon would have a designated section of Lewis gunners, as well as sections of riflemen, bombers, and rifle bombers, all trained to work together in offensive actions. It was this training and evolution of tactics which allowed the Allies to break through and launch the 100 Days campaign and end the war. By the armistice on the 11th of November, 1918, 7,562 members of the Queen's Own Rifles had served overseas during the war. Of these, 1,254 were killed in action, died of wounds, and other causes, approximately 1 in 6. Of the men of QOR who died in action, probably one of the most famous owned this patrol uniform here, which once belonged to Major General Malcolm Mercer. Mercer commanded the Queen's Own Rifles in the years before the war, and by 1916 he was promoted to Major General and commanded 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Unfortunately, Mercer was killed in action in June of 1916, likely due to friendly fire during fighting around Mont-Sorel. Mercer has since had the legacy of being the highest-ranked Canadian officer to ever be killed in combat. Please come back and visit the Queen's Own Rifles Museum and visit our website and Flickr page to learn more about the regiment's fascinating history during the First World War.
Officer here at the Queen's Own Rifles Museum and Archives, and tonight I'm going to take you on a bit of a behind-the-scenes look at what we do each night at the museum. Our museum is completely volunteer-run, and we meet once a week here at Casa Loma to work on the collection. This work includes cataloging, which consists of numbering each object, describing them in detail, and then photographing them. Once objects are cataloged, they can be put away in storage or onto display. So the museum has about 3,000 objects, and constantly growing, and about 500 of those are on display to the public. What the public doesn't normally get to see are our storage spaces. Let's go check one out. Welcome to our uniform closet, where we keep uniforms and uniform-related things. Colin, what are you doing in here?
Oh, I'm just putting a tag about to put away Second War Sergeant's battle dress.
Awesome. So as you can see, we have uniforms everywhere. A lot of them have these nifty little white bags around them. These are tie vests, and they protect things from dust and moisture and that kind of thing. So we're working on getting more of them for this closet. Let's check out one more thing before we leave. Welcome to our office. This also doubles as our archive space. So we have a lot of rare books, a lot of archival folders and materials. And we have Briahna. Briahna, what are you doing?
Just using our overhead camera to get some shots of our nominal rolls here.
How old is that nominal roll?
This one is 1878 to 1894, so one of our oldest.
There you go. Thanks, Briahna. And welcome to the last stop on our tour. This is our main storage space for the museum. We have everything in here from books to flags to champagne bottles filled with champagne still, drums, trophies, matchboxes, trench art. You name it, it's probably in this room. So thank you for coming with us today around the museum, and we hope to see you in person soon.
On 10th of September 1939, Canada declared war on Germany after its invasion of Poland. The 1st Overseas Battalion of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada mobilized for the Second World War on 24th of May 1940. The regiment's first assignment in August of 1940 was the defense of two strategic airfields in Newfoundland at Botwood and Gander. Newfoundland at this time had not been part of Canada, thus overseas. By December of 1940, the battalion was sent from Newfoundland to New Brunswick for additional training and integration into the newly formed 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade, which would be part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. The other two battalions in the brigade were the North Shore Regiment and the Regiment de la Chaudière. This they will be fighting with for the remainder of the war. Eventually, in July 1941, after training in Sussex, New Brunswick, the regiment was notified of being posted to England. The regiment proceeded to the United Kingdom for more training and defensive role defending the island. During 1941, the regiment's Colonel-in-Chief, Queen Mary, visited the battalion while it was at Aldershot. After almost 3 years of training in England, the battalion's first action came, which would be part of the invasion of Normandy, France, on 6 June 1944. At 0812 hours on June 6, the riflemen of A and B companies launched themselves from their 10 landing crafts onto Juno Beach. The small town that the battalion was tasked to assault is the small Normandy seaside resort of Bagnes-sur-Mer. One of only 4 battalions in the assault wave of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the riflemen had been training for this day since 1940. The 200 yards, or 183 meters, between the water's edge and the seawall were raked by machine gun and anti-tank fire, but those who made it soon made quick work of the German beach defenses despite having no tank support. By 0900 hours, C and D companies had landed to support A and B companies, who had sustained heavy casualties on the beach, and together they had cleared the town of Bagnes-sur-Mer of the enemy. By 1730 hours, with the support of tanks and artillery, and after a rough day of enemy resistance, the battalion reached its D-Day objective, Angerney Heights, 7 miles or 11.25 kilometers inland from the beach. The casualties had been heavy, in fact, the heaviest suffered by any Canadian unit that day. 61 other ranks had been killed in action and died of wounds. 6 officers and 69 other ranks had been wounded. 5 other ranks suffered battle injuries. Throughout the rest of the war, the battalion would fight through Normandy, northern France, into Belgium, and then the Netherlands, where they liberated the crucial Channel ports. In capturing the tiny hamlet of Moosoff, Germany, Sergeant Aubrey Cousins was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross for his actions the night of 26 February 1945. The last action of the war for the battalion came at 1200 hours on 4th May 1945, when C Company attacked a crossroads just east of Ostersander, Germany. During the war, the regiment won 20 battle honors, but the cost was high. 463 riflemen were killed in action and are buried in graves across Europe, and almost 900 were wounded, many 2 or 3 times. 60 more QOR personnel were killed serving with other units in Hong Kong, Italy, and Northwest Europe. Only 12 originals from 1940 returned with the battalion back to Toronto in 1945. After the Second World War, the overseas battalions were disbanded. The regiment reverted to its pre-war organization of being part of the Canadian militia. During the 1950s, Canada had overextended itself for its commitment to NATO with the deployment of Canadian troops for the Korean War. In 1951, the Canadian Army created new units for service with NATO in Europe, the 27th Infantry Brigade. This was composed of militia volunteers who would enlist for 3 years in their specific units. The units were 1st Canadian Infantry Battalion, the 1st Canadian Rifles Battalion, and the 1st Canadian Highland Battalion. The 1st Canadian Rifles would serve in Europe and were stationed at Edinburgh Barracks, at Sinelagar, and at Poulos near the Baltic coast. In 1953, the Canadian Infantry Brigade was reactivated and replaced the 27th. At this time, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada were raised. The Militia Battalion in Toronto would become the 3rd Battalion. In 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed, ending the Korean War. Not long after, the 2nd Battalion was selected for duty in the Korean Peninsula. In fall of 1954, Canadian forces in Korea were gradually reduced from 1 brigade strength to that of a single battalion. The Queen's Own were chosen to remain behind. They continued training throughout the winter until they were called back home in the spring of 1955. In October 1957, the 2nd Battalion deployed to Fort Macleod, Germany. They remained in Germany until they were replaced by the 1st Battalion in 1960. In 1965, the 1st Battalion of the Queen's Own deployed to Nicosia district of Cyprus. This mission was part of the United Nations mission there. The battalion watched the Green Line divided the Greeks and the Turkish residents for 6 months. After this 6-month deployment in October 1965, the 1st Battalion were returned to their base at Work Point Barracks, Esquimalt, British Columbia. Again, in April 1967, the 2nd Battalion of the Queen's Own also deployed to Nicosia District of Cyprus. Joining them was a reconnaissance squadron of the Royal Canadian Dragoons. They stayed for 6 months, returning back to Canada in October 1967. In the late 1960s, the Canadian government decided to downsize the Canadian forces. This started with the disbandment of the 2nd Battalion QOR on August 31st of 1968. Riflemen who decided to stay in the Canadian Armed Forces were either transferred to the 1st Battalion or were sent to the newly formed Canadian Airborne Regiment. On April 26, 1970, the 1st Battalion was redesignated 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. With this, the 3rd Battalion of the Queen's Own were now designated the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. In 1983, the Queen's Own were given an airborne task. Since 1967 to current day, riflemen have deployed on numerous missions, to name a few: Namibia, Cambodia, Somalia, Sierra Leone, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Darfur, the Sudan, Kuwait, Iraq, Lebanon, and Jordan. Currently, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada's main station is Moss Park Armories.
Following World War II, many countries around the world were looking to modernize their firearms and their inventories. In the 1950s, Fabrique Nationale in Belgium developed a self-loading rifle using a 7.62 millimeter cartridge. This struck the interest of many countries around the world. As all the NATO countries wanted a version of this rifle, the original FN rifle was designed in Belgium using metric measurements, and Canada took the lead to update the specifications over to use British imperial measurements. In 1955, Canada was the first NATO country to adopt this Belgian-designed firearm, and it was designated as the FN C1A1. Thousands of FN C1s were manufactured under license by the Canadian Arsenals Limited in Long Branch, Ontario. The FN C1 is a semi-automatic rifle that weighs 4.99 kilograms and is incorporated with a box magazine holding 10 rounds of 7.62 ammunition. A fully automatic version of the FN C1 was made that incorporated a heavier barrel, a 30-round box magazine, and a bipod. This version was designated the FN C2. The FN C1 and C2 served as Canada's standard battle rifles from the early 1950s to 1984, when it began to be phased out. This rifle platform has seen service in militaries around the world. Although it is a bit heavy and firing a large 7.62 cartridge, the FN was well liked and respected by many soldiers who used it. In the 1980s, When the FN-C1 was replaced by the lighter C7, many old soldiers preferred the heavier FN.
While the museum has been in Casa Loma since 1970, it existed for 13 years before that. During the early 1950s, when the regiment had 2 regular force battalions, as well as a militia battalion, there was also a regimental depot in Calgary, responsible for training the regular force recruits. In order to help teach these new recruits about the regiment's history, the depot adjutant began collecting relevant historical objects and documents. In 1956, the Regimental Executive Committee approved the official formation of a regimental museum, which would be operated by the depot in Calgary. It was officially opened at Currie Barracks on the 1st of May 1957 by Major General Vokes, with Captain J.R. Schmitz as the curator. It continued to grow and educate hundreds of new QOR recruits. However, by the late 1960s, changes to the order of battle meant the rebadging and reduction to nil strength of our regular force battalions, and the depot became redundant. It was then agreed that museum contents be moved to Toronto and located in the home of Casa Loma, built by our 12th and longest-serving commanding officer, Major General Sir Henry Pellet. The museum opened in Casa Loma on the 7th of June, 1970, in the presence of the Mayor of Toronto and the daughter-in-law of Sir Henry, Mrs. Reginald Pellet.
Hello, Shaun Kelly here again. Today I'm going to give you a brief introduction as to how airborne operations began in the Queen's Own Rifles. In the late 1970s, the Central Militia Area Special Unit was formed in order to provide Reserve Army soldiers in support of the Canadian Airborne Regiment on exercise and in operations. Although its funding was short-lived, the soldiers of the CMASU, as it was called, were amalgamated into the Queen's Own Rifles in 1979, where, with the support of the commanding officer, they continued to build a cadre of qualified parachutists. This continued until 1982, when a contingent of 10 riflemen passed the coveted basic parachute course in Edmonton, Alberta. Following this success, the Queen's Own were tasked to provide a jump-qualified platoon in support of the Canadian Airborne Regiment, which was increased to 2 platoons and a company headquarters in 1984. It was also around this time when paratroopers from the Queen's Own first started wearing the coveted maroon beret. Following the disbandment of the Canadian Airborne Regiment in 1995, the Queen's Own continued to build its para capabilities, including qualifying its first jump master and parachute instructors. This helped lead to a new tasking to support the Canadian Airborne Centre, which was now conveniently located at CFB Trenton, Ontario. With the regular force infantry battalions bringing back their para companies, the Queen's Own were now also tasked to provide support to para company of 3rd Battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, 3RCR, in Petawawa. In 2020, the Queen's Own continued to maintain its para capabilities in support of 3RCR and the airborne community in general by providing instructors and staff to airborne-related courses, conducting combined para-jumps with our regular and reserve Army brethren, and maintaining parachute-capable riflemen who can respond to any and all threats to Canada and Canadians.
The regiment currently is stationed at Moss Park Armories in downtown Toronto. Our current Colonel-in-Chief is Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Cornwall. The Honorary Colonel is Major General Retired Walter Holmes, MBE, MSM, CD, and the Honorary Lieutenant Colonel is Vicky Suohara. The Commanding Officer is Lieutenant Colonel Scott Moody, CD. The Regimental Sergeant Major is Chief Warrant Officer Jeff Johnson, CD. The battalion is composed of the battalion headquarters. The Fighting Company is 60th Company. Victoria Company is Combat Support. Gurkha Company is the Training Company. The regiment's parachute company is distributed throughout the battalion, but mainly within 60th Company, and the band of bugles of the regiment. Currently, the Queen's Own is the only primary reserve unit in Canada tasked to have a parachute company. The company also supports the Canadian Army Advanced Warfare Center. The unit regularly conducts parachute operations on its training exercise and frequently supports the Royal Canadian Air Force by providing paratroopers to support their airdrops current sea training. The QOR of Sea Parachute Company has a strong working relationship with our regular force affiliate unit, Mike Company of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment. The regiment over its 160 years has and always will uphold the unit motto, in peace prepared, in pace paratus.
So this brings us to the end of our 2020 Virtual QOR Day event. and we thank you for participating with us. I'd also like to thank our very dedicated museum team for their hard work in preparing this event, whether in front of the camera, on the microphone, doing the research, or the technical work of editing and compiling all the various segments of this video. I also want to recognize the continued support of the museum and the Regimental family, including the Senate, Trust Fund, Association, and the Serving Regiment. And I know the museum will continue to acquire, preserve, and present the history of Canada's oldest continuously serving infantry regiment for the next 50 years. In Pace Paratus.